for about a month and a half now, I've been talking about the Once Upon a Time characters. I've been going through every season, finding out whether the characters came from fairy tales or not, what kinds of stories they did come from, and what proportion of them came from fairy tales. What I found is that seasons 1, 2, and 7 had a high proportion of fairy tale characters, whereas fewer fairy tale characters were introduced in seasons 3 through 6. However, with many of the series regulars coming from fairy tales, and particularly a lot of them from Snow White, there were always a high number of fairy tale characters present, even in the seasons where very few or no new fairy tale characters were introduced. Now, when I first started this series, I thought that at the end I would break it down character by character. What number of characters come from fairy tales, what number of characters come from legends or myths, and so on and so forth. But I've realized that that's actually not really feasible to do, and the reason for that is that so many of the characters play more than one role. So instead we're going to look at the number of stories. How many fairy tales, how many other kinds of stories among the series regulars and among the rest of the cast. Starting with just the series regulars, there were 7 fairy tales represented. Snow White, Rumpelstiltskin, Beauty and the Beast, Little Red Riding Hood, and then in season 6, the new versions of Cinderella, Rapunzel, and The Princess and the Frog, which is actually the Disney name for that. The original is The Frog Prince, but in any case. There were also series regulars from 4 children's books: Pinocchio, The Wizard of Oz, Peter Pan, and Alice in Wonderland. And then finally, one legend, Robin Hood. All in all, about 60% or 2/3 of the stories that are represented among the main cast are fairy tales. However, that percentage gets much smaller if we look at the show as a whole, because many of the stories that they only kept around for half of a season or a few episodes were not fairy tales. Overall, if you do the calculations, only about 1/3 of the stories that are told on the entire show are fairy tales. The others come from other places, a variety of places, but most prominently children's books, legends, classic literature, and Disney movies. Now, what conclusions should we draw from this? The first thing that I want to say is that I don't think they needed to include only fairy tale characters. I think that there are a lot of other stories that we associate with fairy tales for a reason, and getting very strict about the definition would maybe do more harm than good. I don't think it's a problem, for instance, that they included characters from children's fiction like The Wizard of Oz or Peter Pan. I don't think it's a problem that they included characters from legends that fit pretty well within the fairy tale world. In some cases, I was a little bit surprised by how the things that I thought would fit very well into the Once Upon a Time world didn't fit as well, and some things that I was a little bit more concerned about worked better than I expected. Like, for instance, I assumed that King Arthur would be kind of a natural fit, even though it's not technically a fairy tale. The idea of Camelot being another realm or a kingdom in the Enchanted Forest just seems kind of natural. But because of the way that the Camelot section of the story was handled, it was kind of a side note to the Dark Swan and Underworld stories, and it wasn't really explored in any depth on its own, and was kind of just left hanging. So that's a particular storyline that I think was handled poorly, but not necessarily because the characters or the story that they came from was a bad fit for the show. On the other hand, I had some serious reservations about the idea of classic literature playing such a prominent role in season 6. I love classic literature, don't get me wrong, but the idea of Captain Nemo and the Count of Monte Cristo running around in Storybrooke, you can see why I was hesitant. However, I think for the most part that worked pretty well. I think the fact that so many classics deal with revenge and lost love and other things like that, which Once Upon a Time had already dealt with so much with several of its prominent characters, I think that helped those stories to weave into the overall themes and overarching narrative, even if the stories that they came from were further removed than some of the others. One thing that I think really helped as well was the idea of multiple realms, because while I think that Oz or Neverland being a part of the Enchanted Forest could have worked, having them be other realms in the same way that our world and the Enchanted Forest are separate, I think really helped to separate out the fairy tale characters living in the Enchanted Forest from the other worlds from children's fantasy, particularly classics like Peter Pan and the Wizard of Oz. And then I don't want to forget the original characters. I couldn't come up with a way to count them in my overall percentages and whatnot, but Emma, Henry, and Lucy in particular play pretty important roles in the story, and their stories are pretty original. Now, granted, they draw on ideas from both fairy tales and just, if you're familiar with the idea of the hero's journey, they definitely, Emma follows the hero's journey, particularly early on, so much. But in any case, they're not direct adaptations of a fairy tale, and I don't think that they should have been. Even in season 7, when Henry is Cinderella's prince, his story isn't about finding a glass slipper on the stairs and tracking down the woman that left it there. It's much more involved than that, and it has more to do with reconnecting with all parts of his lost family at that point, because remember, he doesn't remember any of his parents or grandparents or his wife or his daughter or anyone in season 7. It really is pretty far removed from the fairy tale. Anyway, so I think that weaving all of these stories together with the stories of first Emma in the first 6 seasons and then Henry in the 7th one really helped in terms of blending them all together well. Now, I don't want to say that the show was without flaws. It most certainly was not. There were times when I quit watching because I didn't like where they were going with it. But I do think that overall, for blending so many different stories of so many different types together, it didn't do too badly. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this video series. If you liked this and you'd like to see more like it, feel free to subscribe to my channel. I'm posting new videos twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays, and I talk about reading, writing, classic novels, literary concepts, study tips, college tips, and much more.